We'll have this morning two opening statements, and then we'll go at the completion of the description of the mission by the astronauts into the question and answer. At that time, I would appreciate it if you would identify your organization and wait for the handheld microphone. To begin this morning, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert C. Siemens, Jr., Deputy Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Dr. Siemens.
Thank you. We have just finished an award ceremony, and I would like to quickly summarize the awards that were made at this time. First, we awarded to Major General Vincent G. Houston, Deputy DoD Manager for Manned Spaceflight Support Operations and Commander of the Air Force Eastern Test Range, on behalf of the Department of Defense's Recovery Forces, NASA's Group Achievement Award. This was for their outstanding performance in rapidly reacting to an emergency situation in the recovery of astronauts Armstrong and Scott in the Gemini VIII spacecraft. With General Houston was Rear Admiral Henry S. Persons, commander of the Task Force 130, of which the destroyer Mason was part. We had hoped that we would have here Captain Snyder and his crew. They were responsible for the aircraft HC-54. However, they have already been detailed to Thailand on combat rescue assignment, and on their behalf, they were represented by Colonel Allison Brooks of the Air Recovery and Rescue Service. We also had with us here today the three members of Pararescue 1. These very able young men performed the first phase of the actual rescue maneuver by jumping into the ocean, attaching the collar around Gemini 8, and making the first direct voice contact with the astronauts. These three are Airman Second Class Glenn Moore from Cleveland, Ohio, Staff Sergeant Larry D. Hewitt from Manchester, Pennsylvania, and Airman First Class Eldridge M. Neal from Charleston, West Virginia. I must say, three extremely able and attractive young men. Now, I'm very happy to be able to inform you at this time that President Johnson has just announced that Neil Armstrong, a civilian astronaut, has or will receive a quality increase under the Civil Service Program, and also that David Scott, an Air Force major and pilot of Gemini mission, will be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. We made this announcement at our award ceremony, and also presented to these two astronauts our Exceptional Service Award for the remarkable job they did in carrying out the mission and of recovering the Gemini and bringing back much useful data. Now, I would like to say at this time that the Gemini program is permitting us to develop our space capability step by step in an evolutionary manner. Now, I think it's well to keep in focus the forward progress resulting from Gemini 8. It did include on-time successful orbiting of Agena. It included the very precise launch of Gemini 8, and it did include a flawless rendezvous and a most important item, docking of two objects in space, this being so important to our manned lunar landing program and of many other future missions. We all know the difficulties resulted sometime after the docking, and you will soon become more familiar with the details. I think it's important to note two things, however: that planning for difficulties as well as success provided backup modes that permitted recovery, and that Dave and Neil played a key role not only in recovering the spacecraft, but in salvaging valuable data. During the emergency period, they had the presence of mind, as they were undocking, to leave the Agena responsive to ground command and with the tape data intact so that it could be read out to the ground, and so that we could then carefully analyze the difficulties, and so that now we know that the difficulty was in the number 8 thruster. We know that the difficulty was some form of short circuit, and we are able to plan for Gemini 9 and the remaining Geminis, making some modifications to the equipment, of course, and also making some procedural changes. So we are today on top of the difficulty that occurred as a result of the wonderful teamwork, but particularly the work performed by the astronauts. At this time, I'd like to introduce the head of the Manned Spacecraft Center, its director, Dr. Robert Gilruth, who's responsible for this wonderful team that we have here.
Thank you, Dr. Siemens. I think that many of those remarks you made are particularly important, and I would like to repeat one or two of them. At first, when we talk about Gemini VIII mission, I think we all witnessed many remarkable events. To begin with, we saw 2 complex space vehicles launched sequentially on the same day and on time. And what I mean when I say on time, I mean exactly on time. This means launching within a fraction of a second. And I think this Gemini program is the first one where we have seen this kind of accomplishment occur in the space program. And of course, this is one of the major factors in being able to rendezvous in space. It gets progressively more and more possible as we're able to launch these complex vehicles on time. The performances of both these launch vehicles were flawless. The performances of the 2 vehicles, combined with the teamwork of the flight and ground crews, led to a well-executed rendezvous of the 2 space vehicles. We said that Schirra and Stafford's rendezvous was well nigh perfect, and this one fell right in the same pattern. There's one thing, however, we were not able to do in the Gemini VII and VI mission, and that was join the spacecraft together. And as you all know, this is a most important maneuver for doing many things in space. It's one of the keystones of not only going to the moon, which is, as you know, a very important part of this overall program, but of doing almost anything in space, like supply of space stations and this sort of thing. So that we weren't able to do this in the Gemini VII-6 mission, and this was our first chance. This rendezvous then was followed by the closing and docking, and this most important maneuver, which was successfully carried out, has tended a little bit to be overshadowed by the malfunction which followed later on in the dock condition. But I'd like to emphasize it again, and the fact that as Neil and David will bring out, it was not difficult, and it looks like it can be done over and over again as necessary. I would like to echo again what Dr. Siemens has said about the wonderful work done by all the members of the team here, the DoD people, and all those that were honored here today. I'd like to add my personal admiration for their work, and to say that I feel it's a great honor to be part of this team. And now I'd like you to hear the reports from the 2 men who are up in Gemini VIII, 2 of what I feel are among the most accomplished engineering test pilot space pioneers, Neil Armstrong and David Scott. Neil, would you like to start in?
The launch of 2 successful on-time vehicles was, of course, very reassuring to us. Our flight plan was a relatively complicated one, and it depended very much on the launch of both vehicles occurring very precisely on time. We were unable to see the Atlas Agena as it lifted off, but we were informed of its progress by our spacecraft test conductor from the ground, and very encouraged to find out that its launch was on time and its orbit was a good one. Periodically during the first orbit, we were informed as to the status of the Agena, and when we found it was actually in precisely a 160 nautical mile circular orbit, we were, of course, extremely relieved. In spite of the accurate descriptions of the previous crews and of the launch, and my previous experience in rocket-powered airplanes, the launch itself has to be described as perhaps one of the greatest thrills that can ever be encountered by a pilot. The launch vehicle performance was flawless. We had a slight amount of vibration during the early phases of the flight until we became supersonic, and the ride was extremely smooth from that time on. At staging, time when we separate from the first stage of the launch vehicle and ignite the second stage, we encountered a small fireball. This was reported for the first time in Gemini VI, and is apparently a function of the individual characteristics of the timing of the staging sequence. This amounts to flying through a little bit of the exhaust from your own second stage rocket engine ignition. At this time, we felt that we had some deposit on the window as a result of this small fireball. This was again reported by Sharon Stafford on Gemini VI. It was intended to maneuver the spacecraft immediately after second stage engine cutoff to the correct velocity vector to get in the proper orbit. The computer in the spacecraft was to have been used in this flight for the first time for this determination in preparation for some later flights in the program which will require these corrections immediately after insertion. The Gemini launch vehicle, however, put us in a very precise orbit, and no maneuver was required, with the exception of 5 foot per second maneuver used to separate from the second stage. We separated from the second stage as scheduled and saw a lot of debris as reported by earlier flight crews in the Gemini program. And this was just the first visual observation of many that I wish I could convey to you accurately. The sights and sounds of orbital flight are unparalleled here on the ground. I wish that our pictures could be sufficiently accurate to describe the magnificence of many of these observations. Seeing your own thrusters fire, reflections from the window, seeing particles drift away from the spacecraft at extremely low rates, seeing particles from the venting of the gaseous supplies on the spacecraft, watching fires on the ground in Africa, seeing storms from above, lightning and thunderstorms, observing the whole weather panorama from 150 miles or more above the Earth is something that unfortunately can't really be described adequately. The visual observations of previous crews have been described in detail, and we won't propose to try to do better than has been done before. Their descriptions were accurate, but it is still a surprise to see the actual Earth from this altitude. At this time, I think we'd like to talk about the things that we had to do while we're in orbit in preparation for the rendezvous.
Well, another thing that we had been thoroughly briefed on before flight was the amount of time it takes in orbit to perform those normal functions which are usually pretty simple on the ground. And we'd trained for many hours in a simulator and gone through all our procedures numbers of times. But when we got up in orbit actually and proceeded to go through the mission as planned, we found that we were constantly having to press to keep up with the flight plan. It wasn't difficult, but it was one of these situations where you have to keep your mind on what you're doing all the time. And some of the things that we did in the first few orbits were the maneuvers that Neil will describe in a minute, but we had a maneuver about once every 30 minutes, and this required about a 15-minute preparation period with a platform. We had to unstow equipment in the cabin for use during the rendezvous, such as cameras and a sextant, and at one point we took off our helmet and gloves and we had to restow those into a logical configuration that would enable us to work during the rendezvous. We knew we would be very busy toward the later part of the day, so we unstowed some food and began preparing a meal, and it was just about lunchtime anyway. And of course, had to get out the books and charts and flight plan to prepare for the rendezvous. And in the process of doing all this, I would be down in the cockpit trying to unstow or prepare something, and about every 5 minutes I'd get a, "Hey, look at that!" And I'll tell you what Neil says is true. It's just utterly fantastic up there, and when you get a visual sight out the window, it's just very difficult to get back to your job because of the beauty of it all, and it's fascinating. And part of the flight, of course, is to make visual observations and try and describe them. As we progressed through the first few orbits, we had a number of contacts with the ground and preparing us for the actual terminal part of the rendezvous. And before we get that, I think Neil would like to explain what these maneuvers are that prepare us for the actual terminal phase.
The maneuver sequence for rendezvous was essentially the same as the one used for the Gemini 76 flight. The scheme involves 9 separate maneuvers in preparation prior to rendezvous. And this scheme makes maximum use of the ground tracking radar information and ground calculations for these maneuvers to place the spacecraft in the best possible position for the terminal phase of the rendezvous. The first 5 maneuvers are computed completely by the ground operations people. 2 of these maneuvers are small maneuvers to adjust the apogee or maximum height above the ground to the proper value. One maneuver is devised to adjust the apogee to the proper altitude below the Agena. One is for shifting the phase of the spacecraft to put daylight and darkness in the proper place, or to more correctly, put the spacecraft in the right position with respect to daylight and darkness. One maneuver, the plane change, is devised to put the Gemini in precisely the same plane as the Agena target. And the final maneuver of the 5 is to slow the rate of closure between the Gemini and the Agena, and also to level the spacecraft at a constant altitude below the target. The efforts on the remaining Gemini flights will be toward reducing this time requirement so that the rendezvous can take place in less orbits, less time, and less required maneuvers. The last 4 maneuvers are completed on the basis of calculations in the spacecraft. The first 3 were computed by Dave, and the last one is a manual braking maneuver in the close vicinity of the Agena to stop immediately adjacent to the target. Dave?
Well, after being, you might say, set up for the actual transfer maneuver by the ground, we prepared to make this transfer based on a number of cues given by the ground and also on board the spacecraft. And I might mention before I get into it that this particular maneuver is almost exactly like the one we'll use in lunar orbit to accomplish the rendezvous from the lunar surface to the command module in lunar orbit. So in fact, we're gathering data each time we fly now on a system which we hope to use in a couple of years to accomplish the lunar orbital rendezvous. In approaching the, as we call it, TPI, which is a terminal phase initiation, and this burn is the one which takes our spacecraft from a circular orbit lower than the Agena circular orbit and actually allows us to transfer into the Agena's orbit. And the crucial point in this particular transfer maneuver, in addition to the magnitude of the burn, is the time at which the burn must take place. And it's particularly important from the standpoint of lighting conditions, as Neil mentioned, and from the standpoint of fuel. Hopefully you can minimize the fuel by transferring at the proper time, and also have the right visual conditions, and by that I mean, for instance, the star patterns against which the Agena is illuminated, so as to be able to control the relative rates between the spacecraft. This burn must be set up to take care of these 2 primary objectives. We have 3 methods of determining how much this maneuver should be and where it should take place. One of which is through the onboard computer, which has gathered radar data for a considerable period of time prior to the burn. Another method we use is a set of onboard charts, much like a graph that everybody's familiar with. And we enter these charts with a number of pieces of data that we can gather from sources, both from the ground and on board. And third, in case everything else has failed, the ground has given us terminal phase initiation burn that if we had no onboard data, we could execute with reasonable assurance of getting into a successful transfer orbit. Now, one of the beauties of the system, I believe, is that we have many cues from many different sources to allow us to make these decisions. And of course, having practiced with these for 6 months, there's nothing like a little confidence up there to help you make the right decision. And we feel that with the system that has been developed with Gemini VI and now Gemini VIII, that we have a handle on something that we can use successfully throughout the rest of the Gemini program and into Apollo. Some of these cues include angular information is read off the spacecraft dials and obtained through the radar, a minimization of the total velocity required for the transfer, and this comes out of our computer. When we see this go to a minimum value, we know we have in fact reached the point at which we should start our transfer. We have a time based on our onboard readouts, which we can compare with the time that the ground passed us. We have a range that we can read out of both the computer and an analog dial in the cockpit, which we can compare with the range the ground expects us to be from the Agena at the time of transfer. We have a polar plot on board, which gives us the ability to keep a running track of where we are relative to the Agena. And this is particularly useful in that it gives us a trend, and bad pieces of data can be thrown out or disregarded. This also gives us a capability of using some rules of thumb, just some rough calculations that enable us to get a feel for the order of magnitude of the burn. Now, all these different pieces of information get put into the two pilots, and they filter out what's good and what's bad and come up with a decision on when the burn should be performed and the magnitude of the burn. We, of course, always look to the closed loop or the computer solution on board as our primary method of performing the terminal part of the rendezvous. In our particular case, we compared all these items. We found some that looked good and a few that didn't look so good, and at the proper time made the decision to accept the onboard computer solution. And this was based on, as I mentioned, a comparison of all these factors. And one of the most important, of course, is the radar that we have on board. As you know, we feel very strongly about the radar, and it gives us a lot of information to display in various places and put into the computer for subsequent use. Our burn was performed on a time which was within 30 seconds of all the other times that we could gather. Everything agreed fairly well. Neil performed the burn, and we were injected into what we consider our transfer trajectory. Now, as we proceed along this trajectory up to the Agena's orbit, we have the opportunity to make two mid-course corrections to sort of trim out the relative trajectory such that we reach a breaking point at a proper velocity and proper distance from the Agena. In analyzing and computing these mid-course corrections, we have a monitoring technique which again gathers data from a number of different sources and prepares us to take care of any possible failure in the event that some of the equipment malfunctions. And we monitor for three things in particular: the radar, the computer, and the platform. In case any one of these fails at any time between or actually any time during the entire rendezvous phase, we have a set of procedures and some onboard charts that we can enter and follow through and complete the rendezvous. And we feel that with any of these failures, we can complete the rendezvous successfully with perhaps just a little more fuel requirement, but not much. The backup charts and the backup procedures enable us to compute 4 mid-course corrections versus the 2 that come out of the computer. And this also enables us to make a comparison of whether or not, or decide whether or not our computer solutions are reasonable. We did this, and each time the computer came up with a mid-course correction, it looked reasonable compared to our backup solutions and independent observations, both visually and with the radar. And we accepted the computer solution in each case. And this took us up to just about sunrise. At the completion of our second mid-course burn, we were slightly under 4 miles from the Agena, and the sun had at this time risen. We were in daylight, and the optimum situation here is to still be in darkness, but we were a little late on our transfer. The visual was very good on the Agena, and we proceeded in on the relative trajectory to the Agena until about 1.7 miles, at which time Neil began the manual visual braking phase, and I'll let him describe that one.
A number of possible schemes for braking had been investigated during our simulation preparation phase, and we chose one technique that was a middle ground approach, in which a number of small maneuvers were performed to reduce the velocity of the spacecraft to that equal to the velocity of the Agena. I think perhaps we can go to the pictures now and illustrate what view we had through the window. We're waiting for that. I might mention that these ground computations of the maneuvers were very accurate and put us in an orbit that was almost ideal for from the point of view of being able to use a minimum of fuel for the rendezvous. Dave took this picture. Might tell him about Dave.
This is from approximately 210 feet as we approached the Agena, and we had not reached the station-keeping phase at this time. And I might mention here, as Neil mentioned earlier, the pictures just can't capture the view. Unfortunately, we haven't learned yet how to design a camera which can take a background and a near object simultaneously. I think what you miss that we got to see is the fact that the camera here is set to take the picture of the near object, and it brings it out very well. However, it's not able to capture the background. Were we able to capture both, I think you would be able to see what we saw, and it's we hope someday everybody gets a chance to see that. It's just absolutely spectacular. I think you can see here at the previous picture, you can see the bell, and it is very clear that the Agena was in good shape as we approached it. This particular picture was taken after we had started the station keeping, and it's approximately 45 feet from the Agena. The Agena was extremely stable. We could see no motion whatsoever. We could see no attitude gas firing. It was just as solid as a rock up there. One of the things that's interesting about these pictures is if you look to the aft part of the Agena towards the bell of the engine on your left, at the top you can see two chrome domes. These are spherical domes that are chromed, and they're brilliant in the actual visual up there, and it's one of those things that the film just can't capture. If you can imagine almost two searchlights shining from those domes, it's one of the things that we both noticed that couldn't be captured in the picture. At this point, we were moving about around the Agena, inspecting it to make sure it was in good condition, which it was. Could we have the next one, please? This is a position about 2 feet from the Agena, just prior to the actual docking maneuver. And on the Agena itself, we have a docking cone, which is designed to fit the spacecraft nose. We have a slot in the top of it, a V-shaped slot, into which the docking bar that you can see on the nose of the spacecraft goes as you perform the docking maneuver, and enables you to line up for the docking maneuver. The tall antenna sticking up from the Agena is the L-band antenna we use for the rendezvous. The small rod that appears to be sticking in from the right side of the Agena docking cone is what we call a whisker, and this is to take care of the discharge between the two spacecraft as they come together. And Neil will now go into the actual station keeping and docking.
Let's go ahead with the film, please. It's my understanding that these films are being shown approximately in the actual time sequence. They were taken at some at 6 frames per second and some at 1 frame per second, but they've been stepped to look very much like the view we saw out the window, the right time sequence. It's very easy to maneuver around the vicinity of another spacecraft. As reported in '76, we found the reports of the previous flight to be quite accurate. It's indeed easier than we had expected it to be. This was reassuring because later parts of our flight plan included a number of such activities. We did not take too many pictures. We were attempting to conserve film since we had so many later activities to cover with limited amount. The position of the sun, of course, is not the best in all these. Our activities were constrained by other things that we were attempting to do. In that case, we were aligning the platform. Our spacecraft inertial platform was being aligned during that time period. Again, for reasons of collecting data, the docking was performed over the Rose-Knot Victory off the coast of South America, and so that data could be received on the ground during the time of contact. This, however, was just at sunset, and you can observe here that the sun is very low off on the right side, right horizon, and illuminating the right side of the Agena, while the left side and docking cone are in darkness. It's a very unusual phenomenon. Out my window, the world was at night, and Dave's window view was one of daytime. Maneuvering the spacecraft in the close vicinity of the docking cone is not at all difficult. We stopped at approximately 2 feet out from the docking cone and waited until the Capcom on the RKV told us that he had good telemetry, and which took about 2 minutes, and then docked at a closing velocity of approximately 3/4 of a foot per second, approximately 9 inches per second, plus or minus 3. It was our intention to use about 1 foot per second for the docking contact velocity. This is during the time period when we're waiting for contact with the tracking ship. As soon as we were informed that he had data, we proceeded with the docking exercise. Immediately after docking, it was our intention to yaw the Agena using the Agena control system and to 90 degrees from its present heading. The Agena is oriented perpendicular to the plane of the orbit at this point for lighting considerations. Seems to take a very long time here when we're stretched out. You can see, however, that we were quite stable. The two vehicles in close proximity were quite stable. We're getting further and further into darkness, but we didn't have time to readjust the cameras, so these pictures are considerably dimmer than we would like to have. Little green lights above are the status display panel, which tells us about the condition of the Agena. The rose-colored light is reflection from lights inside the cone to help us align the spacecraft for docking. Actually, you're looking at the inside of the docking cone there in the orange colored area. There's docking contact, essentially at night. As you can see out my window, it was quite dark. We saw no electrical discharge or sparks at the time of contact as the spacecraft touched the whisker. This is what was expected and had been predicted by people who had been studying that particular area. Again, the Agena was extremely stable, very easy to maneuver around, and it was very encouraging to us, as much as, of course, the later Gemini program and the lunar program is so dependent on this docking concept. Okay.
Well, the next step in our flight plan was to yaw the Agena 90 degrees using the Agena control system as control from the spacecraft. We did this on time, and we expected to see the maneuver in 1 minute, and it was accomplished in about 55 seconds, and it was extremely stable, more so than we had seen in any of our simulations. It takes about 16 commands to yaw the Agena around and bring it to a stop at any particular point. This time we began regrouping. We had about a 2-hour period of Agena operations we were going to perform, and it was a sort of point of, well, we've got the big one out of the way, and now we can sort of sit back and enjoy flying the Agena for a couple hours and then take a little nap. As I mentioned, things were reasonably stable, and we turned the lights up in the cockpit, got out the books, and started getting squared away for the next series of Agena maneuvers. Pick it up there.
We were aware, discussions with the ground, that some difficulties were encountered in putting commands into the Agena, and there was a little bit of question in our mind as to whether the status of its control system was exactly as planned at this point in time. We were told upon going over 10 Tenerife that in case the Agena did diverge in any manner, we should turn the ACS off and control the attitude of the combination with the spacecraft control system, which of course agreed with our pre-flight plans for difficulties of this kind. It was night, as you see from the docking. We were going into darkness. It was very black outside. As Dave said, we turned the lights up and pretty much disregarded the view out the window. We deactivated the spacecraft control system as planned and began to study our flight plan in anticipation of performing the next series of tests. At just after 7 hours elapsed time, the incident of 7 hours occurred. Dave reported the spacecraft was diverging. We had not heard any thruster activity, or nor had we seen any reflection of thruster activity on a spacecraft. And looking at our attitude indicator, we found that although the rates were low, our attitudes were indeed changing in yaw and roll. This was not considered to be a problem at the time. We assumed that some anomaly in the Agena control system confused the Agena. We immediately activated our own attitude control system, and Dave shut shut down the Agena control system with his encoder.
I might explain at that point how we control the Agena in case it hasn't been described before. There's a small, what we call command wheel in the spacecraft on the right-hand side, which has two concentric wheels and a small lever. And with this wheel, you send commands to the Agena in octal digits, 3 digits. One on each wheel is set in, and then a 0 or a 1 activates the command and sends it to the Agena. And you receive in return, if the Agena accepts this command, a little green light down by the encoder, which we call a MAP light, message acceptance pulse. So I think the first thing at that point was Neil activated the spacecraft system, and I sent our command 400, which deactivates the Agena attitude control system. And I also sent 2 other commands which turn off the Agena georate and its horizon sensors, so as to deactivate what we thought was a problem with the Agena at that time.
For approximately the next 3 minutes, we attempted to bring the combination under control and reduce the rates by attempting different Agena commands. We were attempting to isolate which Agena functions might cause this sort of a problem, and they've sent a number of commands to the Agena, including cycling the ACS on and off several times when it became obvious that this was not completely effective. We began to consider that in addition there may be some sort of spacecraft control system involved. For the next 4-minute period, the rates were reduced almost completely, and we really began to think that we had the combination back under control, and we're proceeding toward the attitude that we desired to be in. Then the problem again uncovered itself, and the rates began to increase to the point where we felt the structural integrity of the combination, since they were joined only at 3 points at the nose, was in jeopardy. And it was felt that some more drastic measures would have to be taken. During this time period, we activated all alternate systems of the spacecraft control system that we could consider without deactivating the spacecraft control system. We changed the logics, changed the valve driver positions. There are secondary systems of many types in the spacecraft control system, and we tried all of them in an attempt to identify the problem. Not being successful in doing so, we reduced the rates to a point where we felt the undocking could safely be performed without a chance of recontact between the vehicles, since there was rotation in essentially all directions. We wanted to be assured that we could get far enough away from the Agena before some recontact between the vehicles was encountered. It took us about 3 minutes to reduce these rates to a value where we considered the undocking operation could be performed safely. And when we mutually agreed to undock, used the undocking switch and backed away as quickly as possible. It was quite evident upon detaching the 2 spacecraft there was indeed a problem in the spacecraft control system, and for approximately 3 minutes we attempted to isolate that problem. the hand controller was inoperative for a period of time during this 3-minute period and prompted a remark which was later received on the ground that we apparently had a hand controller that was either stuck open or not operating correctly. The rates at this time were accelerating to quite high values, and we felt that some more drastic steps would need to be taken. We activated our reentry control system, which is a completely separate rocket thruster and fuel system, and turned the normal orbit attitude system completely off by closing all circuit breakers, closing all valves, and were successful in at that time observing that we did have control and could reduce the rates to an acceptable value. After about 30 seconds of observing that we did have the situation under control once again, we deactivated one of the reentry control system rings. It's a parallel system, 2 separate systems for reentry control system, in order to save fuel. And then for 6 minutes, approximately, we reduced these rates down to a very low value. Once the spacecraft was essentially again stabilized, we slowly and methodically reactivated the orbital system and detected that the number 8 thruster was indeed failed in the open position. Post-flight analysis has indicated that the thruster had been failed on for 3 seconds, off for 3 seconds, then on for 3 minutes, and off for 4 minutes, and then back on. And this ties in relatively well with our observations of when we had the combination essentially under control and when we were unable to control it. Dave might discuss the commands and his thoughts with regard to the Agena at this time.
Well, I think as this was taking place before we undocked, we had decided that, in fact, we had a problem with one of the 2 of the vehicles, and it was our intent to isolate the problem one way or the other and return to the Agena. So before we undocked, we reconfigured the Agena such that it would be available for use after we got the problem straightened out. And to do this, you send a number of commands which activate the L-band transponder for the radar and also the UHF enable, because we realized we were getting close to a ground station, and if there was in fact a problem with the Agena, they could do something to restabilize it. After we had undocked, at some point in time, we had turned the radar on in hopes of catching the Agena again, at least visually, or getting a radar lock, and at some point in there we got a radar lock briefly and sent 2 commands, which one of which turns the Agena tape recorder off and then on, and the other of which, or turns the Agena tape recorder off and the TM off, and the other command turns the telemetry back on. And this was in hopes of gathering the data on board the Agena to help isolate the problem, which the ground can do by dumping the tape that's on the Agena when it gets over a ground station. And I believe after we left the Agena, we saw it one more time approximately a half mile away. It was not in any tumble. It looked like it was probably in an odd attitude from the normal configuration of in the plane or out of the plane of the orbit, but we did not observe any significant motion in the Agena at that time, and that was the last time we saw it.
After reactivating the orbital attitude system, we found that our yaw thrusters were inoperative, all yaw thrusters with the exception of number 8, which was failed open, and our pitch thrusters were operating correctly. the ground advised us that after a good deal of discussion with them about the nature of our problem and, of course, their analysis of the situation, that they were planning for recovery in what we call a Dash 3 area. It's the Western Pacific. And I really didn't recall much more at the time, and it was somewhere in the Western Pacific, and we immediately started pulling out charts to see where in the world the Dash 3 area might be. And of course, we were extremely reluctant to give up the flight at that point. There were a lot of unanswered questions that we had hoped to work on, a lot of additional things which we had hoped to accomplish. But the decision to re-enter in a condition like this with our reentry control system activated, which is one is decided before flight, when you can calmly and coolly decide what the best situation or best reaction to any given emergency might be. And though we did not desire to come down at all and would have very much liked to stayed up there, it seemed reasonable to agree with the ground recommendation at that point and prepare for a recovery.
Well, our next order of business then was preparing the spacecraft for reentry and getting set up for the 7-3 recovery area. And I might this time mention that the Capcoms on the RKV and CSQ, with whom the only people we had contact until reentry, did an outstanding job. They were pressed for time, as we were, but they had to communicate with Houston and get all the data up to us necessary for reentry, which normally takes some 3 to 4 hours. They did this in a couple of passes, and not only did we appreciate it, but it also helped us in our time being able to have all this information readily available and be able to prepare ourselves for the reentry. We had to restow a number of items which we had not planned on prior to the flight, and at this time we were also in a configuration in which we had planned to have another couple of days to work. So we had our TV monitor unstowed and back in an orbital stowage location. We had sextant out. We had 2 cameras out, a number of film packs. I had an EVA visor which was to have been discarded the next day. We had food packs out. And we also had a unique situation in the computer. Due to the new math flow we had for the rendezvous, the computer or the spacecraft now is configured such that there is a magnetic tape on board that can be read into the computer for additional computer memory. And we launched without a reentry program in our computer, which was as planned. The computer was fully loaded with the rendezvous equations and math flow. It was necessary for us to reload the computer with this magnetic tape before we could make a reentry. And this is called an ATM, or auxiliary tape memory. We performed this particular operation without a hitch. It was the first time it had been done, and there had been a number of questions, and I think we at least answered that this does in fact work extremely well. Another thing I think we forgot to mention in the Agena, one of our operational tests was to have been a bending mode test with the Agena, and I think we successfully demonstrated that the spacecraft Agena combination will hold together pretty well. We loaded the ATM and we got all the data from the ground and checked the computer. The reentry load had gone in successfully and our retrofire time was counting down. And I'll let Neil pick it up from there and take us on down.
All parts of the sequence from then on operated correctly. Of course, this retrofire was done over Africa, with the reentry taking place over Arabia and Pakistan, India and China. And there was no tracking capability during this time period, and we did not have a lot of the information available to us that we would normally have in a reentry trajectory across the United States. The retrofire, fortunately, was located close to Kano, Nigeria station, and we were able to hear the people in Houston counting down for retrofire. We heard them count 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and we lost them. But we kept counting, fired the retros on time. And fortunately, the retrofire velocity vector was very close to that anticipated. Based on the spacecraft measurement of that retrofire increment, Dave computed a bank angle that would take us to the target in case something about this computer combination that we had to work with was not operating correctly. Calculated 52-degree bank angle. Appreciate that this spacecraft does have lifting capability. It really does glide back into the atmosphere, although at a very steep angle, and its impact point can be controlled by pointing the spacecraft in the proper direction during the reentry trajectory. This bank angle computation on his part was important from our point of view. The computer, however, did work very much as it was supposed to, and we get our first indication by a needle movement at 400,000 feet, some 21 minutes after retrofire, and at that time this indication came up correctly and gave us a great deal of assurance that the computer was in fact working as planned. After the computer appeared to be navigating correctly for the next several minutes, we committed our bank angle to the one recommended by the spacecraft computer and attempted to precisely steer in the direction of the target. The view out the window, again, is a spectacular one. The view of the ionized sheath of very high temperature gases coming off the spacecraft, the view of the spacecraft retro adapter burning up some several miles behind the spacecraft. I wish I'd had more time to look out during that time period, but I thought it was imperative to stick pretty close to the steering commands given on the panel. After we put our drogue chute out at 50,000 feet, Dave read out the latitude and longitude where our computer thought we were. It's a new feature, part of this new capability that Dave was discussing, and the latitude and longitude were very close to what we had expected. What was that, Dave? You recall?
Well, I believe the ground had passed us up something like a longitude of 136.01, and the computer told us we were 136.09. I believe the ground said the latitude should be something like 25.10, and we were 25.05, so we felt like we had come reasonably close anyway.
When I asked him if he recalled, I knew darn well that he recalled, and he'll never forget those numbers in his whole life.
It's pretty comforting to have a computer on board that tells you where you are when all you can see out the window for about 30 minutes is the Himalayas.
The landing sequence worked completely the way it was supposed to. The parachutes all worked fine, and we had been told that the sea conditions in the landing area were 3 to 5 foot waves and some light overcast. When we got on the chute, of course, you appreciate that all we'd seen was land for the last 10,000 miles, it seemed like, We weren't really sure that we were over the water at all. And hanging from the chute, you're looking up rather than down, so we got some mirrors out, peeked down back to make sure that we were over water. After finding out we're over water, we released the single point release on the spacecraft and went to the landing attitude, splashdown, somewhat of a jolt, and started concerning ourselves with recovery.
Well, it wasn't very long thereafter that we heard an airplane fly over and had no voice communications, however, but we did hear him. And then about another, I would say 15 minutes after we hit the water, we saw him fly by. And we were cheered up by this thought. However, as he went by and we could get no radio contact, he sort of rolled his wing over and took off in what looked like a standard search pattern. Now, the rescue people have a philosophy that once you've searched an area, and they have a very thorough method of searching, but once you search an area, the probability of finding somebody in that area is rather low, and you should go to another area and search. So he flew by, and we didn't have any radio contact, and we heard him no longer, and all of a sudden there was a lot of water out there. But within about 5 minutes, we heard the engine again, and lo and behold, out of the aircraft came a bright orange parachute, and a young gentleman by the name of Neil landed some, I'd guess, 40 yards or so from the spacecraft. And one of the interesting things about our particular situation then was we had expected 3 to 5 foot waves with our weather report in orbit, and we did have 3 to 5 foot waves, but nobody had said anything about the 10 to 15 foot swells. So we saw our swimmer in the water periodically as we would go up and he would go up while we'd see each other, and it took him some time to get to the spacecraft. And about the time he arrived, another swimmer, our pararescue man, came out of the aircraft, and this one landed approximately 15 feet in front of the nose of the spacecraft. And I'll tell you, that's really hitting the mark. And as he came down, we both commented on the amount of gear this man carries. You can hardly see the man. He's got so much on. And we found out later on that he carries about 140 pounds of gear. And you saw him in here this morning. I imagine he weighs 125 or 30. Then we got the third one, and I'll tell you, these three men were a real welcome sight. And they went about their business attaching the flotation collar to the spacecraft, which we feel is an essential item for opening the hatches. And we were rather warm on the inside, and these men were working pretty hard on the outside, and I think it probably took us about an hour before we were stabilized with the collar on the spacecraft. And during this time, we had one radio contact with the aircraft, and it was a good one on UHF, and they told us they'd seen us on the chute, and they had us all squared away. But that was the last time we talked to them on the spacecraft radio.
We turned in HF, trying that mode, and heard lots of communication, but it was mostly Oriental music. There was nothing intelligible to us.
On a clear channel frequency. We were informed both in orbit and by the aircraft after we got on the water that the USS Mason was approximately 3 hours from our splashdown time and on the way. And also shortly thereafter, two SA-16 amphibians came over. And we didn't expect them to land because of the sea state, but they did circle, and there was quite a group out there for a while. Finally, over the horizon, after we had opened our hatches and had a good rest there, we saw the USS Mason coming full bore. And I'll bet that's the fastest that destroyer has ever traveled in its 22 years of life. They came alongside, and it was a matter of about 4 or 5 minutes from the time we got to the bow as the ship passed by that we were on board and the spacecraft was on board. And I want to say that was an extremely professional operation. Those people knew what they were supposed to do, and they performed it rapidly and extremely efficiently. And as we mentioned, there were some pretty big swells, and there was quite a bit of relative motion between the spacecraft and the ship. And as a matter of fact, periodically we would slam against the side of the ship, and it was concerned us both. And it looked like it might be a difficult task boarding the ship from the spacecraft. Neil got out on his side, and as is our plan, I closed my hatch and I got out on his side also. He was able to grab a ladder, and by the time I got up on the nose of the spacecraft, it had shifted and there was no ladder in sight. And I looked up and I saw a couple of hands, so I just grabbed. And I'll tell you, two of the biggest, strongest hands I've ever felt just yanked me out of that, pulled me up on the ship, and I was standing there looking eye to eye with this great big fellow with a black patch, and he says, "I've got you, sir." And I'll tell you, he really did, too. It turns out that in his day, he'd been a professional boxer. Well, I guess that takes us to about the ship.
It was interesting to find out that this particular ship was named after Leonard F. Mason, who happened to live very close to my hometown, within just a few miles away. And I believe his mother is still living there. I look forward to seeing her in the near future. I think it's probably appropriate to introduce to you those people who sat home and concerned themselves more about this than we did during all these activities. I'd like to introduce my wife, Janet. And my father and mother, Mrs. Stephen Armstrong.
And I'd like to introduce my wife, Lurton. And my father and mother, General and Mrs. Tom W. Scott.
Ready for questions and answers? And please identify your organization and wait for the mic, okay?
You mentioned that the rate of revolution was more than once a second. Dr. Berry said he thought that you were approaching the limits of your physical capability. What physical shape were you in? How near were you to being unconscious? What were you thinking about? What were you able to do?
Well, I'd like to say that I don't know precisely what the rates were, but it was approximately 1 revolution per second. We didn't have any specific difficulty in observing the panel. We did have a little bit of difficulty with particular head positions and identifying the proper circuit breakers and switches on the overhead panel. However, these rates were not particularly new to us. I think it's appropriate to say that all pilots, and certainly test pilots in particular, have the opportunity to encounter these sorts of rates in spinning airplanes throughout their flight career, and it's extremely good practice for a situation like this where you have to learn to selectively observe and in some cases disregard the various visual observations and concentrate on those things in the cockpit that are pertinent to identifying the problem. Dave, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I would agree with that. It was similar in many respects to a spin in an aircraft, and as Neil mentions, you learn to select the important things and disregard the unimportant things, and this helps you know into maintaining your orientation.
You hadn't begun to gray out or anything like that?
No, I think that we were perhaps some distance yet from those sorts of physiological problems. I don't know what whether their limits are established.
Jules Bergman, ABC News. Neil, what changes have you and Dave recommended and procedures to be followed in case there's a repetition of the OMS thruster failure, especially if this should have happened while Dave was outside or while Gene Cernan's outside in EVA?
Well, as you might imagine, a number of people here at the Manned Spacecraft Center have concerned themselves with this very problem, and I haven't been able to talk with them in great detail about their analysis of the situation now, but I can tell you that a number of things are being done. First, the components in this particular area of the circuit are all being examined in extreme detail to find out if there are any component changes that need to be made, modifications, and up to the present time it appears that this may not be the case. A change in the wiring such that all thruster power can be removed simultaneously from the spacecraft is being implemented in the spacecraft, although the details of that wiring are still under study. The method has not been completely determined, but that function will be provided in spacecraft from now on. Our procedures are being analyzed very carefully to see that we can obviate this kind of problem by procedural methods during flight. We would anticipate doing that. And finally, additional tests are going to be performed at the Cape very late in the count to assure that similar problems cannot show up during the period of time between that testing at the plant and the final systems test at the Cape.
What would you and Dave have done, though?
As I understand it, this was a random electrical failure that could have occurred at any time. It could have occurred while Scott was outside, either on the short feather, on the long feather, or cradled in the back during the nighttime pass. I'm wondering, Neil, in your view, what would have happened had that occurred, had that decision gone wild at any one of those 3 times? What would have been the result? And specifically, how dangerous would it have been for Scott?
Well, that's precisely correct, Mr. Hines. It could have happened at any time. There's no reason for us to suspect that this particular failure was caused by any particular event or occurrence in the spacecraft. The occurrence, if encountered during EVA activity, could be a serious one, of course. The rates were small initially, and I think that should this occur, that have occurred in our flight plan, why Dave might very well have been able to re-enter the cockpit and get the hatch closed. However, then additional time, of course, would have been required to analyze the problem, and I really would not like to speculate beyond that as to what the sequence events might have been.
I might add something there, since you're playing what if. It might be remembered that this particular circumstance occurred between ground tracking stations. Had it occurred over a station, they would have been able to tell us immediately that our number 8 thruster was stuck on, because they have this data on the ground. In addition, there is a possibility that had I been outside, I could have viewed this and told Neil immediately, your number 8 thruster is stuck on, turn it off. So it's very hard to speculate on something like that. It's a tough what-if game to play.
Our purpose here is to realize the situation that happened, take the corrective measures, and assure that it doesn't happen in the future.
Had Dave reviewed in his mind ahead of time, had the training covered a possible emergency, a potential emergency like this during EVA?
Not this particular occurrence, no, although we'd certainly concerned ourselves with all types of failures that might be within the realm of possibility.
Sean?
Shorey Powers, KMSC and United Press. Dave, you've been talking about comparisons between your spacecraft and airplanes. I wonder if you could tell us whether or not you can compare in your transfer out of your orbit up to the Agena orbit. Do you have somewhat the same sensations as you would have in an airplane on an intercept or a formation join-up?
Not initially. Initially, you're too far out to to really see the detail of the Agena. But as you approach the Agena, it becomes a very distinguishable cylindrical object, and I think, from my impression, it would be very similar to joining two aircraft together, and I think maybe Neil could tell you better because he did it, but in watching him, it looked to me like he was just making another join up, and it was real smooth and real steady. He might describe it better to you.
In that particular area, as well as a number of other areas in the flight, I was particularly struck by the similarities between experience in the spacecraft and experience in aircraft. It really made us feel at home and feel confident and feel that our aircraft training was indeed a great benefit to us.
It's a very similar sensation when you get up there. You actually feel like you're flying. When he performed a maneuver with the maneuvering thrusters, well, I felt just like you'd kick the afterburner in on an aircraft, and the sensations are very similar.
Ben Kate, Time Magazine. Neil, can we go back over the firing sequence of the number 8 thruster? You said from the TM that it fired on 3 seconds, off 3 seconds, on 3 minutes, off 4 minutes, and then it came on again for how long?
Continuously at that point until the system was.
How long is continuously?
Well,
you know how many more minutes?
Till a total time period, elapsed time of 7 hours and 15 minutes approximately.
How many more minutes did it fire?
Pardon?
That was when it came back on the last time. How many minutes did it fire?
I guess.
25 minutes or so.
No, it wasn't that long. I would guess about 10 minutes. 8 to 10 minutes. I don't have the time histories here to refer to, but.
Ernie.
Pete Baldwin, Aviation Week. Did you find did you get any cues from the thruster firing noises?
We did not.
Helpful at all?
We expected that whenever a thruster fired, we would hear it based on our experience in maneuvering up prior to that time. However, we had never had the opportunity to listen to a single thruster down on the bottom fire, so we can't identify that that's indeed a fact. We did not hear the thruster fire at the time of the occurrence, and we did have our helmets off.
Well, then don't you think that it would be helpful to have some kind of cue, such as a light or some other signal of some type?
We thought that we had both sound and light cues available to us, and we found that if they were there, we did not identify them.
Neil, I understand you and Dave also chalked up another honor in Gemini VIII in addition to the world's first docking, which was you landed closer to the splash point than any other spacecraft ever has. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that's a tribute to the equipment. We were actually depending on the spacecraft computer inertial guidance platform combination to give us that information and navigate to the proper place out on the ocean, and it was just really a matter of following its commands once we identified that it was operating correctly.
What was your actual figure? No one's ever told us that.
We looked for a benchmark out there and couldn't find one. Couple 3 miles away.
Off of Gilruth.
Art Hill, Houston Chronicle. Neil, I'd like to know, from the transcripts, it appeared that for a moment there, at least, you thought there was some difficulty with activating the RCS. That's part of my question I wish you'd clear up, and then I have another.
Okay. First, with respect to the RCS, initially upon activating, we were operating in a so-called ACME mode, which is a mode in which the hand controller operates through electronics to the thrusters. upon later evaluation of the configuration of the control system, we found that some of these circuit breakers in that electronics were either popped or that we had inadvertently turned them off during the sequence of checking the system. So we went to the direct mode, which allows you direct electrical control from the hand controller to the thruster itself, and this is the method by which we regain control. After re-engaging those circuit breakers that were open, we found the system worked as it was supposed to work.
And I'd like you to go through the docking again for me, and I'm curious to know whether when you actually docked there was any motion one way or the other, what it sounded like, and whether the coupling worked exactly as it was supposed to.
From our point of view, it worked even better than it was supposed to. The actual contact was very smooth. The target docking adapter adapted itself very well to the attitude of the spacecraft. The latches engaged immediately. The cone withdrew to its rigid position. We got the light as expected, the rigid light, and we observed no Agena motions as a result of the contact.
Dave Strang, World Aerospace Systems. Was the Agena control system on at the time of the malfunction? In the transcripts it says that you saw them firing, saw some firing from the...
Yes, it was, and we later observed on proper lighting conditions that we could see the thruster plume from the Agena rocket, and this was a little bit confusing to us at the time because we were under the impression at that time that we had the Agena control system shut off.
Jack Long, KPRC News. While you were being brought back to land, the idea of an in-flight rescue was brought up in Congress and was asked that we should have a system for this. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm sure there's certainly some merit to that approach. However, at the present time, I would guess that at this stage in the program, it takes so long to develop that sorts of capability that our effort should be expended toward removing any problems that might exist in our spacecraft design.
Jeff Thompson, KMSC and United Press. Dave, during the emergency, you said you didn't have the reentry data in the computer. As a result of your experience now, do you feel that that data might need to be fed into the computer in duplicate form in every memory that is fed to it?
Well, I had hoped I had explained it. The computer itself has a limited amount of memory and capability. And the purpose of not having the reentry data is to allow the computer to have a reasonable amount of rendezvous data. The more you can get in it, the better chance you have of achieving a minimum fuel rendezvous. I think it's a trade-off situation. It takes a very short period of time to load the computer with the reentry data, and there's no particular problem in doing this. It's not a complicated process. It's very operational. And I think the configuration we have now is an optimum configuration for the mission.
Might mention there that we did have the tape oriented within that recorder to the position so that we could enter the reentry data in a minimum amount of time. And it only takes about 4 minutes to do it. And of course, in 4 minutes, we can also be doing a lot of other things that are required before retrofire. So we don't consider that to be a constraint. We think it's a good system the way it exists now.
Joe Maloney, Houston Post. Do we know yet precisely where in the spacecraft the short circuit occurred and whether this was a cause or the effect of some other failure?
Careful examination of that circuitry isolates it to approximately four or five components and some wiring. It has not been identified since this equipment is still in orbit even now, just precisely within those components where the failure occurred. But each and every component is being analyzed at the present time to see whether any obvious possibilities exist. In general, say that really the system is quite good and this is a very remote failure.
I'd like to ask two questions, things that I'm still not clear of in the answers you've given before. First, I'm not sure just what happened. It's hard to understand how there could be a short circuit in a system that's deactivated. Have you really ruled out the possibility that you either accidentally or intentionally activated some electrical system somewhere in the spacecraft at about the time this trouble occurred? That's one.
The answer is that in spite of the fact that we had the equipment deactivated, there was indeed electrical power to the valves themselves, and these valves are then energized by grounding the other side of that circuit. So all that needs to be required is that some short to ground be encountered. Now, in the modifications that I mentioned earlier, it is being rewired such that power can be removed upstream, and that the electrical power can be removed from the valve with a single switch.
You both had your hands in your laps at the time it suddenly went crazy.
For all practical purposes, that's the case.
The other question is, I'm not sure whether you feel that you can now go on with EVA without knowing for sure what went wrong on Gemini VIII.
Might comment on that.
Well, I'd like to say that we are sure what went wrong in Gemini VIII. It was a short to ground that caused power to go to one of the thrusters. And this, as Neil has said, is a very remote occurrence. It has been described here. It couldn't have happened at a worse or more confusing time in this mission. But it's not something that, it's a very unlikely thing to happen. And one of the things that made it difficult at this time was the fact that they had just joined with the Agena. They had thought they had power off of their system, and they were nowhere near a ground station. Now, if any of these three things hadn't have happened, they could have turned this thing off and really continued on with their flight. It was three very unlikely things all occurring at once, which made this as serious an occurrence as it was. And it's taken some good detective work, both in flight by them and then later by all the teams going over what happened from the recorded data to sleuth out what could have happened to have made this thruster go on. We think we've found it. And I would say there are things that we're doing, as Neil has said, to make this less apt to occur, or this kind of thing less apt to occur, but we expect to be able to reach a state where we're confident of going EVA on the next Gemini mission.
I have a question for Neil Armstrong that's fraught with insignificance. As I understand it, you've received a raise, courtesy of the President, that amounts to about $5.94 a week after taxes, and I'm wondering what you're going to do with the money.
Your question, I'm sure, is much better than my answer, Bill.
Ben?
Neil, you mentioned you had trouble with the overhead panel. Was this an orientation problem, or was this a focusing problem with your eyes, or a little bit of both?
We found that by positioning our heads in certain locations, it was very difficult to read the panel. Now, this is not it's not a new problem to pilots. Pilots everywhere are familiar with vertigo and its effects and how to avoid this situation. It was just we observed that it was a fact. We avoided that position of our head subsequent to that time, and it gave us no real problem.
Siguro NHK Japan, have you expected before launch any accident will take place during the mission, as Gemini, all the Gemini craft up to 7 went okay, so I suppose you had high reliability on the spaceship.